Welcome, everybody. Today I'm going to be reading from Theojonas Megara on Substack, who has recently done a translation of Ernst Nolte's book, European Civil War, 1917 to 1945. An extremely important book, and I would encourage you all to donate to Theojonas of Megara. He's done a fantastic piece of work with this, so check him out on Substack. If you just Google the European Civil War by Ernst Nolte, Substack, and Theojonas of Megara here, as you see, you'll get his website, his Substack. Okay, so let's look at the preface. This book and the historian's dispute, a balance sheet after 10 years. Dispute, confrontation, is something quite ordinary and endless in science and journalism. Where there is no dispute, there is no spiritual life, and at best, there is only the inner harmony of a sect. For time to time, the term is used with special emphasis when the major tendencies clash and wrestle with each other for a long time. In German historiography, there was the method controversy over a sociological or collectivist approach of Karl Lamprecht, and later in sociology, the positivism controversy. Another significant and monumentous dispute among historians was the so-called Fischer controversy of the 1960s, which raised the question of the character and extent of Germany's guilt in World War I, but which took its name from the initiator or author. The term historians dispute today is almost exclusively associated with the argument that began in 1986 and continued with great and increasingly one-sided bitterness until the autumn of 1888, when a statement by the French president, the Bamberg Historians' Day, seemed to mark the end. So let's just read it again. The term historians dispute is today exclusively associated with the argument that began in 1986 and continued with great and increasingly one-sided bitterness, and at least until autumn 1988, when a statement by the then federal president, the Bamberg Historians' Day, seemed to mark the end. In 1991, publication listed nearly 1,200 articles and nearly 36 books that had been published by the end of 1988. Only the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany caused interest to wane. However, it was precisely these revolutionary historical events that raised the question of whether there was an internal connection with the historians' dispute, and whether one could even say that history had made a decision that could not be brought about by these theses and arguments. One of the starting points of the dispute was the intention of the federal government to build a German historical museum in Berlin, and this plan was almost unanimously criticized by left-wing intellectuals in the strongest possible terms, because it seemed to stem from the desire to dispose of the German past to recover a normal view of history. But this diverted the view from the singular crimes of National Socialism and pushed the desire for radical new beginning into the background, which admittedly had been neglected in the history of the Federal Republic from its beginning in comparison with the urge for a revival. This museum was actually established in Berlin in 1991 in the armory of Unter den Linden, where the GDR Historical Museum was located. The other side, which people liked to call the right wing, had not made the corresponding demand either. If it had done so, the waves of indignation would have been far higher. In 1986, Jürgen Habermas spoke with a high negativity of the, quote, German national tinted NATO philosophy, end quote, attributable to the opposing party, and had fought in opposition against a view that instrumentalized the, quote, expulsion of the kulaks, end quote, in Stalin's Soviet Union, in order to relativize the singularity of the Nazi regime and to label the Soviet Union as a hostile power that was, quote, still on our doorstep, end quote. In 1991, there was general satisfaction that the reunified that Germany remained, quote, anchored, end quote, in NATO, and no one seriously doubted that the power that was now withdrawing its troops from Germany had an enemy, and the enemy of the whole, quote unquote, West. In 1986, Hans Mommsen was extremely negative about anti-Bolshevism, about those, quote unquote, anti-communist resentments, which the opponents see as decisive and which find their expression in the, quote unquote, theory of totalitarianism, a theory which considers, quote, merely external similarities to be constitutive, end quote, and does not want to admit it, that the communist systems of rule, in stark contrast to the fascist ones, are not subject to any process of self-destruction. In 1991, quote, dissidents took over the governments everywhere in Eastern Europe and made no secret of their anti-communism, or at least anti-Sovietism. The term, quote, totalitarianism was used by almost all intellectuals as a matter of course, and by no means only with reference to Stalinist phases, that the events had been preceded by a, quote, self-destruction of communism, had become an obvious insight. The view that the 20th century actually only began in 1917 with the October Revolution of the Bolsheviks and ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 also seemed to be gaining ground. But with all this, the question that had proven to be the core of the historians' dispute by 1988 were in fact not answered. Whether between Soviet communism and militant anti-communism of the fascist movements and regimes, especially the radical fascist National Socialism that came to power in Germany, that there was a relationship of action and reaction, of challenge and response, of the original and the copy, and whether a causal nexus, if it did exist, could also be established between the extermination measures of the two regimes. It was precisely these problems that were articulated in my article, quote, The Past That Will Not Pass, in the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung on June 6, 1986, with the question, quote, was not the Gulag Archipelago more original than Auschwitz? With the statement, a causal nexus between the two is probable. Questions like these could not be decided by historical events alone. They could, however, be explained more comprehensively and justified more clearly. This is exactly what happened from my side in the present book, which appeared in 1987, and it was the prerequisite in the matter as the result of that article, which nevertheless may be regarded as its exposition and source-based elaboration. Certainly, even the book alone cannot dispel the counter-arguments, the main point being that NS must be explained from the premises of German history, and that this also applies to A, Auschwitz, i.e., the final solution of the Jewish question, as an absolutely singular, indeed incomparable event that lacks the rational connection that existed in the Gulag between real enemies of the regime and their destruction. Furthermore, the physical destruction was not intended in the Gulag, but only formed an incidental, even if terrible and extensive consequence. Another objection is that the struggle between two ideologies and mass movements, communism and National Socialism, was merely a mask for the power struggle between two great states, so that the term European Civil War was unjustified. The two declarations do not cancel each other out, because they contradict each other, because at least the NS regime must be ascribed state character of a very special kind if one does not want to arrive at the absurd opinion that there was no Auschwitz in the First World War was only by chance. The weight of a third objection cannot be denied either, that the extermination measures against real or alleged enemies, i.e. the Gulag and Auschwitz, were consistent actions of two cleansing ideologies, but were merely parallel phenomena between which there were no causal nexus. A completely different kind of argument than this one were the allegations and insinuations concerning the motives of the main participants or their effects. The goal was to surpass German crimes. What we have done in an apology for the leaders of the Wehrmacht, in the whitewashing of German industries, in the macabre offsetting of mass crimes against one another, and the guiding principle was the desire to make Bolshevism or even Marxism the real culprit for all the crimes of the 20th century, and consequently the intention to promote the great oblivion that has long been around Germany through relativization and historicization. As far as I know, in all these polemics, the consideration of whether it might not be a matter of more comprehensive and fairer resemblance has not even rudimentarily been raised. One might have expected, however, that after 10 years and after the surprising developments of this decade, some representatives of the, quote, other side in the historians' dispute would have asked themselves what balance should not now be drawn, whether one should not renounce some of the old arguments and agree with the opponents in one respect or another. If I'm not mistaken, this happened on the part of only one of the participants, namely Heinrich August Winkler, who wrote an article in the Frankfurt Rundschau of October 29, 1996, titled Inspection of the Observed 10 Years Later, a retrospective of the German historians' dispute. Winkler reproaches himself here for having displayed an unjustified self-assurance 10 years ago in another article in the same newspaper, and for demanding that the Germans no longer strive for a sovereign nation and should therefore recognize the two-state system, which was after all a consequence of the fateful role Germany played in both world wars. But his view was based on a secularized theology of history, which was also decisive for many of the other left-wing contributors to the discussion. The conviction that the NS crimes could be atoned for by the division of Germany had become the great lifeline of the West German left. And today, it was time to question the morality of many moral-sounding and morally cautious arguments from the time of the historians' dispute. In this way, Winkler brings up a considerable amount of self-criticism, but with regard to the adversary who put forward these objectionable theses about the causal nexus, he held his earlier opinion. Ernst Nolte had an apologetic intention, that he had argued nationalistically and revisionistically in the long version of his article in the European Civil War 1917 to 45. He had taken up the theme of the century, of the interrelationship between communism, fascism, and democracy. But because of its intent of apology, the ordeal had ended in an analytical debate. In a less direct way, however, other participants have also commented on the topic of the historians' dispute after the course of almost 10 years, and thus potentially contributed to a balancing that Winkler postulated but hardly already carried out. The causes was the publication of Daniel Goldenhagen's book about, quote, H's willing executioners. Goldenhagen, a young Jewish-American political scientist, took the orthodox view to the extreme, even to the point of caricature. In his presentation, essentially, only the Germans and the Jews appear, and the relationship between them is reduced entirely to anti-Semitism on the one hand and victim status on the other. Already in the 19th century, and basically since Luther, the Germans, with a few exceptions, were filled with a eliminatory anti-Semitism, which under Hitler unfolded with all too great consequences into an exterminatory will. This had not been so much realized in the gas chambers of A and Treblinka, whose efficiency was greatly exaggerated, but in the hundreds of thousands of murderous acts carried out with zeal and lust by the SS, the police battalions, and the Wehrmacht. The Bolsheviks and the gulags are not mentioned, nor is the international situation of 1939 to 41, and nor is the hostility towards Jews that was widespread in Baltic states and Ukraine. Only the confrontation between German murderers and murdered Jews is of importance. From this perspective, the thesis of the causal nexus between Gulag and Auschwitz does indeed appear to be utterly absurd. Goldhagen occasionally calls the murderers Weltanschauung warriors, but in connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism appears at most for fleeting moments and is further assigned to the delusions. Goldenhagen emphatically underlines the principle of understanding and even emphasizes that the perpetrators considered, quote, the mass extermination of the Jews to be justified, end quote. But his understanding and the perpetrator's self-understanding only coincide with the concept of delusions. This means that a very clear verdict of guilt can be reached, and Goldenhagen seems to be completely lacking in the awareness that with this collectivist attribution of guilt, he is doing nothing other than what the National Socialists had done by blaming the Jews for the Red Terror, for the atrocities of the Cheka, and for the great extermination in the Gulag. None of the, quote, left-wing German participants in the historians' dispute identified with such an extremism. And, for long stretches, a simply ignorant position, not even Jürgen Habermas, who of course praised Goldenhagen at the 1997 Democracy Prize. Goldenhagen had written history from the deeds of many individuals and not from the constraints of bureaucratic apparatus or from the decisions of a charismatic leader. Hans Mommsen, in particular, dealt with Goldenhagen's view in numerous statements and interviews, and suddenly his long-known and often revisionist interpretation, which took the blame away from the weak dictator Hitler and assigned to the leading classes of Germany, took on the character of an apology, namely an apology for the German masses, who in Goldenhagen appeared to be the actual culprits. However much he expresses himself in neither intentionalist terms in some places. Hans Ulrich Weller was in favor of welcoming Goldenhagen's astonishing public impact as a welcome effect of the respecting his, quote, perceptible moral indignation. But he noted serious weakness that radically discredited Goldenhagen's explanation of the properly presented facts, i.e., the diabolization of the Germans and thus the ethnicization of the debates, his, quote, terrifying self-righteousness, and also the omission of the, quote, terrible decades-long murders of millions under Lenin and Stalin's dictatorship. However, Weller does not have so much the omission as such, but rather the possible and quite mistaken derivation of these crimes from a tradition of Russian barbarism. Erhard Jackel, on the other hand, who had seen a miserable practice of undercutters at work on the other side of the historians' dispute and had put forward a highly questionable thesis about allegedly public announcements of the murder of Jewish women and children by Hitler, characterized Goldenhagen's book as, quote, thoroughly flawed, unsuccessful dissertation, which falls back to the state of research of the 50s and completely neglects the main task of research, namely to explain the connections. But was not the overwhelming success of Goldenhagen's book, and was not the author's triumphant tour of Germany, broadcasting studios and auditoriums, the most impressive proof that the Habermas-Willer assertion was at least in some sense correct? That the attack of national apologetic revisionism had been beaten back and a great victory had been won for the Germans through, quote, coming to terms with the past. It could be, however, that this fight against forgetting only served greater forgetting. The German self-glorification of the National Socialist era was simply turned into a German self-condemnation, and that the alleged debacle was precisely the way to a deeper self-reflection and to a more adequate understanding of the context of the history of the 20th century. In any case, some publications of the 1990s by world-renowned historians suggested that such a presumption was well-founded. When Alan Bullock's Hitler and Stalin was published in German translation in 1991, the memory of the historians' dispute was still fresh enough that astonishment was often expressed at how little excitement was caused by a topic that bore so much resemblance to the question of Gulag and Auschwitz. In fact, Bullock's preliminary remarks clearly set himself apart from the Germanocentric view that had so largely dominated discussion in Germany. In his search for a frame of reference in which the larger context of Europe's recent history, could be better understood, he turned to the German-Russia axis, neglected by Western historiography. This, he said, made possible to compare between the two revolutionary power systems at home. Possible, the Stalinist and National Socialist, both seemed at the same time to stand in irreconcilable opposition and to have many things in common. Both had, in each their own way, challenged the existing order in Europe ideologically and politically. Their simultaneous appearance on the stage of history embodying their mutual relationship and interactions. It seems to me embodies the most remarkable and novel phenomena of the first half of the 20th century, a phenomena whose aftermath extends far into the second half. This postulates the comparative account of the two revolutionary regimes that were fundamentally related and interactive. The first question would have to be whether, quote, revolutionary meant the same thing in both cases, and whether one revolution was also, or initially, in a one-sided relationship to the other, in such a way that one would have been the precondition for the existence of the other, and thus the relationship of action and reaction would have existed. Such a relationship was, after all, taken for granted by the two regimes as a matter of course. One, the Bolshevik always saw himself as the embodiment of the revolution, which was opposed to the counter-revolution in the form of the fascist regimes, and Hitler repeatedly declared that his party was protecting Germany and Europe from the global danger of Bolshevik cultural destruction. Bullock, however, does not take this path of inquiry. Instead, as the subtle title suggests, he portrays parallel lives, namely the lives of two men who were the almost unlimited rulers of their states for 12 and almost 30 years, respectively, but who had a different relationship to their own revolution or counter-revolution. Stalin was the successor of the party founder, whom he always took a back seat, at least in his official statements. Hitler, on the other hand, was the founder, and to that extent should be seen as the opposite figure or the parallel to Lenin. When Bullock deals in the first 3 chapters with the origin, the early experiences, as well as with October Revolution and the November Putsch, and contrasts Stalin and Hitler, of course, he also speaks of Lenin. There he also speaks of Lenin, but the early history of the Bolshevik Party up to the coming to power in November 1917 comes only a little into view, while Hitler is most identical with the early history of his party, and the Munich Putsch attempt of November 1923 must in no way be put into the parallel of the October Revolution. Only in the NS seizure of power in 1933 does the parallel appear, and it takes place in Bullock's book upon reaching page 409. Bullock's book thus consists of several chapters that depicts the lives of Stalin and Hitler with strong reference to their history of Russian or German parties and the Russian or German states. The Russian Revolution, the central figure of which were Lenin and Trotsky, is therefore not described in detail, and the reader does not get the impression that Hitler's early days were significant influence by the relationship to the revolution. Only with the 14th chapter, which is devoted to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, does a relevant interaction begin, and it is not told much differently than it would be told in any history of Europe of the 20th century. On the whole, then, the parallelism is certainly there. The reciprocal effect comes into view late, and the originally one-sided relationship of that, quote, revolution and counter-revolution, as Stalin and Hitler themselves saw the relationship with opposing values, does not play a significant role. In this respect, Bullock continues the line of structural analysis and analytical totalitarian theory, which also understood its double object. The Bolshevik and National Socialist regimes primarily as parallels. What was inspiring and attractive for countless people about the two movements and regimes is at most only partially emphasized here and there. What was terrible, on the other hand, is very much emphasized. According to Bullock, Stalin brought his people, quote, suffering and death to an extent for which there is no parallel in history. And the slave empire under the rule of the SS that Hitler brought into existence in Eastern Europe was, quote, in no way inferior to the extent or in the horrors it spread. To terror regime that, quote, that Stalin and the NKVD established in the Soviet Union. In this respect, Bullock, as Hannah Arendt and Karl Friedrich had done, places, quote, Kulak and Jews next to one another. Occasionally, however, there is a talk of an intrinsic interrelation of ideologies, which is hardly a mere parallel, as when it says, quote, if one replaces race with class and radical elite with Communist Party, the subordination of the individual to the Volk by the subordination to the state, one would get the outlines of a worldview that Stalin would have had little fault with. But Bullock does not make an essential distinction. He sees Hitler's main enemy, the Jews, is only the diabolical, quote, invention of a pathological philosophy. The Holocaust ultimately has a completely different character from the extermination of gulags. Party enemies and Polish officers, here mass murder was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. So the parallel lives of Stalin and Hitler end not only in the radical opposition of triumph on the one hand and total defeat on the other, but also in that of purpose and rationality or irrationality of the two regimes. But at the very end, Bullock comes to speak of the events of 1989 and 1990, which in his eyes mean a far-reaching reversal of the situation in 1945. Because the Soviet people are facing an economic catastrophe and must ask for help from Western states, and especially from Germany, which in its western part has reached a, quote, remarkable level of prosperity and stability. The era of Stalin and Hitler is over, but it took 17 years as a result of the survival of Stalinism until the end of the 1980s. As many questions as Bullock merely hints at and leaves unanswered as a consequence of his approach to the parallel lives of two men, it is nevertheless certain that, from his perspective, all attempts to separate Hitler and Stalin and to make them self-sufficient subjects as interpretations of the 20th century are wrong a priori. Another English historian, Eric Hobshaw, who for a long time was primarily known as a Marxist and an authoritative social historian, after his book on the 19th century, also presented in 1994 a world history of the 20th century, to which he gave the title The Age of Extremes. He is far more involved in the whole wealth of events than Bullock, and there is hardly a state or an important political movement that is not mentioned in at least one sentence. But the common thread is never lost. The title seems to imply that the main topic would be the various totalitarianisms, and that Hobshaw, like Bullock, would proceed on the lines of structural analytics theory of totalitarianism. But right from the start, it becomes clear that he assigns a place of paramount importance to the Russian Revolution, because according to him, in the years 1989 and 1991, a world, quote, which was shaped by the effects of the Russian Revolution of 1917, end quote, broke up. True, he was the short 20th century, began in 1914 with the outbreak of the Great War, and one must speak of the, quote, 31-year world war, end quote, since the Treaty of Versailles had so many injustices and weaknesses that, quote, a new war was practically certain, end quote. Nevertheless, Hobshaw does not conceive the history of the first half of the century primarily as a history of the declared and undeclared wars between the great states. A new quality emerges from the fact that the opposition to the war and the will to a completely new structure of life prevailed. In one of the states, the October Revolution, was just as central an event for the century as the French Revolution of 1987 was for the 19th century, end quote. The fact that that their main intention was the complete destruction of the Russian and European bourgeoisie is apparently not seen by Hobshaw as something negative. But it is not quite clear whether Hobshaw, despite some self-criticism, is not convinced that Marx will be right in the longer run. In any case, according to his account, Wilson's 14 points were already a reaction to the Russian Revolution because they played a nationalist card against its universal appeal. Likewise, the very moderate stance of the Socialist Party was essentially just a reaction to Bolshevism. A, quote, causal nexus is thus self-evident for Hobshaw, and the same is obviously true of Hitler's National Socialism, which was counter-revolutionary and a kind of right-wing extremist equivalent to international communism. With Berlin as its Moscow, end quote. However, an extraordinary complication arises from the fact that for Stalin, revolution was more and more, quote, just rhetoric, and that the fascists showed themselves to be able to mobilize the masses from below. Hence, these are to be called the, quote, revolutionaries and counter-revolution, end quote. Despite such reversal, the fascist movements and regimes remained essentially different from the communist ones, for they were a response to the real danger of a powerful social revolution and a strong working class, and Nazism plagiarized the Soviet regime in a considerable extent. The epoch can consequently be best understood as a, quote, international ideological civil war. And in the end, Hobsbawm even defines the entire short 20th century as an age of wars of religion. And among the secular religions, he includes socialism as well as nationalism. But in the second half of the century, these religious wars obviously took place outside of Europe and America. For example, around the deeply murderous dictatorship of Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, and admittedly Ceausescu. The main characteristic of European American development were precisely the golden years of capitalism between 1950 and 1973, whose reality evidently represents a phenomenon difficult to explain for Hobsbawm, since he is by no means inclined to agree with the theologian of the free market, like Hayek or Friedman. But since 1973, a new age of crisis has been approaching, and it seems that for Hobsbawm, the extreme does not lose its significance even after 1989. And the end of the short 20th century, the extreme horrors of the age of modern civil war, the extreme horrors of, quote, age of modern religious wars, therefore have a place only in Asia and Africa in the second half of the 20th century, while in the first half, the epoch of the actual ideological war, civil wars, both in Stalin's Bolshevik Russia and Hitler's NS Germany, Hobsbawm, while mentioning the Holocaust right at the beginning, conflates it with the starvation and deaths of hundreds of thousands of residents in Leningrad and around 3.5 million victims among Russian prisoners of war. Auschwitz, which does not even appear as a name, apparently does not occupy a completely singular place in the abundance of events. And as much as Hobsbawm sees himself as an anti-fascist, his judgments, in many places, distant and unemotional, for example, as when he attributes to, quote, Nazi Germany the merit of being the only Western state to have overcome unemployment between 1933 and 1938, and when he makes a very critical judgment of Zionism. Francois Fourier, who was a member of the French Communist Party for some time in the 1950s and 1955, book Le Passé d'une Illusion, which intends to be a, quote, essay on the communist idea of the 20th century, and yet in no way absorbed by it, emphasizes the central importance of the Russian Revolution. The, quote, charm universelle of October, even more strongly than Hobsbawm does, and makes this fascination much vivid because he exemplifies with some important men, such as the left-wing Catholic Pierre Pascal and Russian Jewish petty bourgeoisie Boris Sorvian and Georg Lukács, the son of a Jewish upper middle class in Hungary. For these three men, as numerous others, the Russian Revolution was the lighthouse in the darkness of the period marked by the First World War. It appealed to passions even more than to idealists. In making sense of the apparently senseless, took hold of the whole human being and not just the intellect. For Pierre Pascal, Bolshevism is by no means anti-Christian, but the revenge of the humiliated. Boris Sorvian is filled with deep sympathy for the little people in Russia who have not yet been touched by Western individualism. For Lukács, a double self-hatred plays an important role, quote, the self-hatred of Jew and that of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Pascal and Sorvani moved away from the Soviet system after a few years, albeit hardly from the idea of communism, which here and elsewhere underlies the criticism of empirical aberrations. And even Lukács became a dissident in 1956. Although he remained convinced that Stalin was the incarnated reason of world history. For French intellectuals, one of the many attractions to communism was that the fact that the Russian Revolution was traced back to the French Revolution in the influential works of eminent historians such as Arnauld and Mathias, and thus was a further stage in the triumphant advances of equality, emancipation, freedom, and fraternity. Only Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago finally broke this fascination, a fascination which has been seen as conspicuous in England and even America between the wars, as it had been in France. Fouriet is not satisfied with describing this gradual disappearance of the communist faith. In its heyday, it gave rise to another ideology, the fascist ideology, which Fouriet, like so many authors before him, characterizes as a reaction and which regards as the other great myth of the century. Fascism arises as a reaction to the particular against the universal, of the people against the class, of the nation against the international. It is, in its beginning, inseparable from communism, whose aim it combats by imitating its methods, end quote. In all its forms, however, it is not a mere reaction, no mere counter-revolution. It has its, quote, own magic of the future, end quote. It is as fascinating for quite a few intellectuals as communism is for many others. It can give meaning to the lives of individuals. Thus, fascism appears as an almost equal counterpart to the communism of European tragedy. And as little as Fouriet denies his own past and the anti-fascist past, the principle of, quote, understanding comes to the fore, which keeps away from the hasty moral judgments. The goal is to, quote, understand the 20th century, end quote. And this results in much more of, quote, mourning than partisan articulation. Sometimes it even looks as if Fouriet regards it as a misguided and deplorable development, that the idea of fascism has become after the war the object of, quote, forbidden radical, and that the demonization erasures it an afterlife, but only an afterlife that serves to guarantee the victors the perpetuation of their triumph and which gospel Germany to pay for all the crimes of the century. But this judgment is not an absolute one. It only refers to the apparent triumph of the communist view, which prevented the decisive insight that communism, like fascism, constituted one of the great anti-liberal, anti-democratic reactions in European history of the 20th century, end quote. Communism and fascism are therefore both similar and dissimilar to one another, and the movements as well as the regimes waged a struggle against each other, which can with good reason be described as European civil war. But through such a distant understanding, those crimes which in a certain way represent the climax and at the same time the self-refutation of the two ideologies do not get out of sight. The great crime against the Russian and Ukrainian peasants, which was absolutely singular, because never before in history had a state set a goal of, quote, killing, deporting, or enslaving its farmers. And a decade later, the NS crime against the Jews, which was no less singular, although, or because, for Fouriet, it was not caused by any causal nexus to the Gulag and collectivization. At the final result of the history of the 20th century, Fouriet notes that the victory of the third side, the capitalist side, which was sometimes barely visible in the struggle of the great two idiocratic regimes, the victory of private property, the market, and human rights, but as much more understanding of fascism as he is than Hobsbawm, so much less does he seem to be convinced that this victory could only be a temporary one. Neither Bullock nor Hobsbawm nor Fouriet accept the reason given by Stalin and many Western European intellectuals for the war of extermination against the kulaks. It was indispensable for the modernization and industrialization of the country. One of the three takes even less serious. One of the three takes even less serious the justification put forward by Hitler and not a few NS for the initially only aimed at separation for the war of extermination against the Jews. The Jews are, quote, all communists, end quote, and therefore responsible for the Cheka terror and the Gulag. On the top of that, the Western capitalism. For Fouriet, however, the narrative itself shows that, in fact, an unusual high percentage of Jews did indeed occupy leading positions in Marxist or communist movements in France and elsewhere. But Fouriet would also undoubtedly agree with the following thesis. Even if all the accusations made against the kulaks by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union have been correct, and even if all the allegations made by the NS NSDAP about the Jews had been true, it would be morally condemnable to kill defenseless men and women without legal trials. Even children, or even to simply deport them to an unknown, would be morally condemnable. Only from a historical point of view would distinctions possibly have to be made, for there is an unmistakable difference between kulaks who refuse a reasonable delivery of grain and German or French Jews who do not differ in any way from their French and German compatriots. In order to make such differences, and at the same time the fate of the collectivist attribution of guilt clearer, I take a look at the diaries of novelist Victor Kempler, wrote during the years of 1933 and 1941, which were published in 1995 under the title I Will Bear Witness. If anyone was allowed to feel completely German, it was Victor Kempler, personally a Protestant, holder of a chair of Romance languages at the Technical University of Dresden, exemplary intellectual, a cultural man, frontline fighter in the World War, married to a, quote, Aryan woman, end quote, even if he was the son of a rabbi. But immediately after the 30th of January 1933, the anti-Jewish campaign of the NSDAP, the legal execution of Jewish civil servants, and the boycott of Jewish businesses hit him with terrible force. Although he was initially spared, like the other frontline fighters, the hatred he felt for the NS was the beginning is the hatred of the educated citizen and the intellectual for the demagoguery and irrationalism of a mass movement, among whose components he counts, quote, Americanism, technicism, automatism, deification of the Führer, end quote. He feels a similar aversion to communism and even to Zionism, which, with its radical doctrines, is a, quote, source of the Nazis, end quote, and which discriminated against the Aryans in Jerusalem in the same way as it does against the Jews in Germany. In 1935, he was compulsorily retired, and his previous colleagues avoided him, quote, like the plague corpse. Yet for him, there is absolutely no Jewish question in all Germany at all, because in his opinion, the friction between Jews and the, quote, Aryans was not half as great as, say, between Protestants and Catholics, or between employer and employees, or between East Prussia and Southern Bavaria. There was only one solution to the German or Western European Jewish question, he writes, namely, quote, the mating of its inventors. However, he obviously considered an Eastern Jewish question to be real. And even when the Yellow Jewish Band was introduced in 1941, when he was forced to live in a, quote, Jewish house, he sees the reason not merely as arbitrariness and torture, but rather the fear of, quote, Jewish criticism, end quote. In all of this, nothing would be more natural for him to condemn the entire German people, who is so unflinchingly follow Hitler. Indeed, some of the phrases actually sound as if they were an endorsement of Goldenhagen. For example, the situation is bleak. Hitler literally corresponds to the German people's will as a reason for the people's will be mentions not anti-Semitism, but the fear of communism and communist Russia. All of Germany prefers Hitler to the communists. He remarks, although both movements are materialistic and lead to slavery, even some Jews protect the Nazis to a certain extent because they fear communism. That Hitler is to be the savior from Russia is certainly the opinion of 79.5 million Germans. Even the, quote, Jewish house, there is a man who, as a former officer, quote, is a monomania of German soldiering and acts more nationalistic than any Nazi, end quote. On the other hand, Klemperer notices next to nothing of anti-Semitism when he has to bear the name, quote, Victor Israel, and wear the, quote, Star of David. Quote, I often wonder where the wild anti-Semitism is. For my part, I encounter a lot of sympathy. They help me out, but of course, fearfully. The officials in the tax office are exemplary, polite. The passers-by sympathized with the stand-bearers. The people undoubtedly feel the persecution of the Jew as a sin, end quote. An apartment neighbor thinks that every Jew has an Aryan angel, and, as is well known, Heinrich Himmler said exactly the same thing in one of his speeches, albeit in a tone of criticism and accusation. The consequence of this exclusion and collectivist attribution of guilt, which affects people who, according to Klempler, quote, would be Nazis if they were not affected as Jews, is, in the eyes of this German Jew, extremely paradoxical and at the same time fatal. Hitler is the most important supporter of Zionism. He literally created, quote, the people of the Jews, world Jewry, the Jew. But this strange fact is only the result of National Socialism, its elementary prerequisite. However, according to Kempler, is nothing else than the relationship to communism, which, unlike the Jews, is threatening and frightening for the great majority of German people. It should now have become clear why, quote, the European Civil War 1917 to 45, and also the article about the past that will not pass, end quote, was about, even to some extent, fascism in its epoch, was about not about exculpation or incrimination, burden or exoneration, accusation or apology, but to one of the possible conceptions or paradigms of interpretive guidelines of European history and world history in the 20th century. The main question to be addressed to it is whether it grasps the context or fails to do so, whether it illuminates or obscures, expands or narrows it. A possible restriction of political or propagandist guilty verdicts, different distribution of light and shadow, will only result from this, but it must not be the prerequisite. However, certain the individual historian will have his preferences and dislikes. The only scientifically legitimate dislike, however, is that which appeals to the will to achieve political goals, which ruthlessly ignores unsuitable facts. However, each paradigm inherently has its own limitations. Precisely for this reason, there must be no strict closure from one another. The number of possible paradigms is small, however, and numerous examples from historiography can be cited for them. The national paradigm may claim its practical priority. For centuries, states, whether monarchical aristocratic states or non-nation states, have been the supreme and most capable political units. Nothing was more natural than that historiography made them its theme as soon as overarching concepts and realities such as Christianity ceased to be prominent. The story of the Great Rebellion of Lord Clarendon has as its subject an important period of English history. Voltaire's story of the age of Louis, despite all its tendencies towards cultural and moral history, is nevertheless largely devoted to the development of the French state system. The English and French states, however, were older than the historiography on which they became the subject. In Germany and Italy, however, historiography preceded the formation of states, and the historians of the small German schools, such as Sibyl, Treitschik, and Droysen, did not hide their desire to promote the emergence of a Prussian German nation state through their work, and some applies to Italians like Carlo Botta and Cesare Balbo. The fact that Bismarck's Germany was structured differently than that of Gladstone's England, and even the France of the Third Republic, namely constitutional instead of parliamentary, was considered a positive fact and was not infrequently viewed as a special path that took Germany away from the weakness and deterioration of, quote, Western, end quote, liberalism and parliamentarism. The strong monarchy was seen as the last root of Germany's rise, and the concept of positive German special path, Sonderweg, reached its culmination in the so-called ideas of 1914. The defeat in World War I brought about no significant change, and for the few NS among the German historians, Germany, quote, is hardly more in the center than for the German nationalists. Nothing was more obvious than after the second defeat in the 1945, the positive accident should be replaced by a negative one, and the German special path understood as the origin of NS. The difference between industrial modernity and the pre-modern political system, which differed from the condition in the West, had prevented the political rule of the bourgeoisie and the development towards a democratic revolution. Thus, the feudal authoritarian state plunged into the War of 1914, and after 1980, only the aristocratic warrior ethos was democratized and bulgarized, so that the NS state, contrary to the spirit of the times, had been able to launch its war of conquest and exploitation against all other states in Europe. The present task was to end the special path and to join the Western democracy system without reservation. There is no doubt that this national German paradigm, both in its negative and its positive form, has or had considerable explanatory value. Since 1970, all major decisions had been made in the capital Berlin, and they all wished to serve the good of the people of the nation. 2 world wars for which Germany was responsible seemed to prove irrefutably that these decisions and developments had in truth not been for the good, but for the disaster of the nation. After 45, therefore, positive nationalism could at least still be used in a historicizing way to correct the excesses of negative special path thesis. And the NS interpretation was to be completely discredited. To continue to allow H the peaceful intentions that he had often proclaimed was simply no longer an option. And it was obviously wrong to make him a victim of treachery of diplomats and generals by emphasizing the lack of adequate war preparation. The only possibility of a, quote, neo-national socialist historiography was probably that of English historian David Irving, had more hinted than explicitly outlined. The cooperation between the leading classes and Hitler, which was so strongly attacked by the advocates of negatively formulated special path thesis, was not condemnable, but had even been only future possibility, provided that it had been developed a compromise between Germany and England in 1940, which, however, had been prevented by Churchill. And his kind, if it had come about, the Holocaust would not have taken place in England, would not have lost its empire, but even if this interpretation were given a truth value, it could only have a nostalgic character today. And Hitler himself had far exceeded the German national paradigm by considering himself a leader of all Teutons and even all Aryans in the context of national German emancipation after 1945. Only the negatively accentuated Sonderweg thesis was of practical importance, and this gained inner strength because it was connected to the tendency of social historiography, which went back to Karl Lamprecht to produce the great achievements in the form of the Annals school in France. But there was a more original social historiography, a conception of social history which strove with much more decisiveness to transcend national borders and made the concept of the class more exclusively its center. This was the Marxist paradigm, which was based on universalist philosophy of history and which had already produced historiographical works such as the 18th Brumaire by Louis Bonaparte, by Marx himself. Here the starting point was not a particular state, but the overarching process of industrial revolution, from which a powerful international movement emerges, namely the workers' movement. Its destiny is to fulfill the unrealized postulates of bourgeois liberal revolution, namely freedom, equality and fraternity, and to lead the hetero-capitalist modernity into the insurmountable summit of global society without classes and states. In this perspective, the German special path became irrelevant because it did not differ in essence from the path of the Western nations. And the task was much more ambitious than the modernization or even the democratization of existing class structures could ever be. Although the suspicion soon arose that the Marxist vision of the future was not modern at all, but archaic in its orientation towards the conception of human family and individuals existing in complete reciprocity without alienation and objectification. The harmony was the universalizing tendency of the modernity was nevertheless so palpable that pre-1914 Marxism could with good reason consider itself the property of progress, the wave of the future. The historiographical work of Franz Mehring was also born by this enthusiastic confidence. And in his old age, he welcomed the Bolshevik Revolution with a decisive step towards the reality of a socialist world. Okay, so next time I'm going to read page 18 or page 18 of say of 25. So we'll read that next time. Okay, take care.